In today's video, I'm going to walk you through how health savings accounts work and why I think it's one of the least appreciated but best possible ways to save for your retirement. Hey everyone, I'm James Knoll, founder of Root Financial, and I'm here to show you how to get the most out of your life with your money. So I believe health savings accounts, or HSAs for short, are one of the absolute best planning tools for retirement, but not many people know that or know why. So in today's video, we're gonna walk through what it is, how it works, and some common planning strategies so you can make sure you're most effectively implementing your HSA if it's something you have access to. To start, let's walk through how it works. Well, when we talk about retirement accounts, whether it's IRAs or Roth IRAs or 401ks or Roth 401ks, there's generally two ways that you're saving taxes, but there's three ways you could potentially save taxes. So the three ways you could potentially save taxes is as money's going in, as money's growing, and as money's coming out. Typically on retirement plans, you're choosing two of the three. With HSAs, you get all three. So for example, if you have a 401k, you're saving money on the way in, you're saving money on taxes on the growth, but you're paying taxes when it comes out. So tax-free, taxable. With a Roth IRA, it's the opposite. No tax savings on the way in, but then it grows tax-free and it comes out tax-free in retirement. Well, HSAs, the beauty of them is it's tax deductible on the way in. So you save money on taxes when you make the contribution. It grows tax-free, and you can pull the money out tax-free if it's for a qualified medical expense. So that triple tax savings is something you really don't get anywhere else. The caveat to that is there are two states that unfortunately don't recognize HSAs. One is California, so my home state, and the other is New Jersey. So at the federal level, you're absolutely getting the ability to take advantage of these deductions. And in 48 states, you're getting the ability to take a deduction if your state has income taxes. But in California and New Jersey, they don't recognize HSAs, which means you just pay taxes on it like a regular brokerage account. But that's how the accounts work, is you get the tax benefits, and if money's coming out for qualified medical expenses, as I mentioned, anytime, does not have to be after retirement. It could be today, it could be tomorrow, it could be before 59 and a half, after 59 and a half, at any time. If you're pulling money out for qualified medical expense, it's totally tax-free. So that's the amazing benefit. Now here's the kicker. If you invest into your HSA and you keep investing and you're not using those funds, and we'll talk about a provision of that in just a bit here, that money after age 65, you can actually use for anything. So if you run into the issue where you're saying, I've got a lot of money in my HSA account, what do I do with it? I don't have that many medical bills. Well, if you don't use it for medical expenses and you're 65 or older, you can actually pull that money out to spend on everything. Now it does become taxable when you do pull it out if it's not used for medical expenses, but keep in mind, it was tax-free on the way in and tax-free growth along the way. So it kind of just like turns into another 401k or another traditional IRA where you got the tax benefits up front. You still get the tax-free income if it's used for medical expenses, but if not, then you use it like you would a traditional IRA. So pretty darn cool. There are limits to how much you can put into an HSA. And for 2022, if you're single, the limit is $3,650. If you're married, or if you have a family plan, it's $7,300. Now, if you're 55 and older, not to be confused with 50, so for retirement plans, age 50 and above, you start getting the catch-up contribution. Well, for HSAs, it's age 55. If you're 55 or older, you get an extra $1,000 that you can contribute, which is $8,300 per year. So that's how much you can contribute to the HSA. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, if I contribute that and I don't use that, do I just lose access to the funds? No, and that's the beauty of this. With an FSA, so a flexible spending account, those are the accounts that are typically use it or lose it. There may be a small amount that carries over to future years, but with an FSA, if you don't use all those funds by year end, you just lose those funds. The beauty of the HSA, and there's some really serious planning points I'm going to go over in a second here, is as you're putting that money in, if I don't use it all this year, it rolls over to next year. If I don't use it all next year, it rolls over. And so you can keep rolling this money over, and that's why it can be a wonderful long-term retirement planning tool, because you can use these funds at any time. And not only can these funds roll over, but you don't have to keep these funds in cash. The way HSAs work is depending on your HSA provider, they might require that you keep $1,000 or $2,000 in cash. So they're banks, and the way they get their money is by having cash on deposit. But any amounts above that, so any amounts above $1,000 or above $2,000, whatever your specific plan's limit is, you can invest those funds. So as you're putting money in, think about it like an investment account. If you don't intend to use those funds in the short term, you can grow that money, which means you can fund more medical expenses completely tax-free in the future, or have more money that could be used like a traditional IRA in the future if you have more than enough to cover your medical expenses. Now let's talk about eligibility. Not everyone can use an HSA or health savings account. To qualify for a health savings account, you have to have a high deductible healthcare plan. So if you don't have a high deductible plan, you're unfortunately not eligible for an HSA. They kind of go hand in hand. It's the plan's way, or it's the IRS's way of saying, let's make the high deductible plan more easy to save for, because higher deductible means you're out of pocket more before insurance starts kicking in. But in order to help offset that, it can be combined with an HSA. This has nothing to do with whether your plan's a PPO or an HMO. It could be either. It just has to be a high deductible plan in order for you to qualify to use an HSA. Now, just to be clear, that's to use an HSA. Let's say you have a high deductible plan and you have an HSA and you're contributing to your HSA, and then a few years goes by and you change jobs or change coverage, and you no longer have a high deductible plan. What that means is you can no longer contribute to your HSA, but your HSA can still continue to grow and you can still continue to use it to fund your medical expenses. Now here's one of my favorite aspects of HSAs, and maybe one of the little known aspects of HSAs, is I can use the funds at any time. Meaning I can withdraw the funds at any time, even if it's not in the year that I incurred an expense. Let's take a look at this. Let's assume that I fund my HSA for my family at $5,000 a year, and I do that for the next 10 years. Let's also assume I break my arm every single year. And every single year, I incur $3,000 of medical expenses to fix my broken arm. Well, if I pay for those expenses out of pocket, meaning instead of taking funds from my HSA to pay for that, I take funds out of pocket and pay for it, what that means is my HSA balance continues to grow. So if after 10 years I've incurred $30,000 of medical bills and I've put in $50,000 to my HSA, and maybe my HSA balance is now $70,000, $80,000 with some growth, well, the nice thing is I can take out that $30,000 of expenses that I've incurred at any time, even if it's 10 years later or 20 years later. So this can kind of serve as like an emergency fund for some people, where I can say, I'm going to pay out of pocket now, because if I keep funding my HSA, one, I want those dollars to keep growing so they can pay for more medical expenses, maybe if I want to retire early or if I'm concerned about medical costs in retirement. But number two, let's say I lose my job, and let's say I have no more income, and let's say I've burned through my emergency savings. Well, I can then take out $30,000 from my HSA to pay for all those years that I broke my arm in years past, and I can do so completely tax-free, meaning the withdrawal does not have to coincide with the year that I incurred the expenses. This is why it's important to keep track of your receipts or keep track of your expenses, because you can take it out, and if the IRS said, okay, well, show us those expenses, you would just need to have an itemized list of what those expenses were so they could see you weren't taking out more than your expenses, which would no longer be tax-free. So that's one incredible way that HSAs can be used through some really good planning. Here's another way, and this is one of my favorite ways to view HSAs in the context of someone's retirement plan. Let's assume that you have an HSA, and let's assume that you fund it, just for easy numbers again, with $5,000 per year. Well, there's two different things you can do with this. Let's also assume that you have $5,000 in medical bills in this year. Well, if you have expenses of $5,000, the traditional thinking, and it's not bad thinking, but what most people tend to think is, okay, I'll take this $5,000 and I'll pay for those medical expenses tax-free. So that $5,000 I've never paid taxes on, I pull it out tax-free to pay for my medical bills. Well, let's say 20 years goes by and the same exact thing happens. You have $5,000 of funding to your HSA, you also have $5,000 of medical bills, and this same thing happens for 20 years. What would happen over that time period is you would have put $100,000 into your HSA to pay for $100,000 of medical expenses. So it was still a very strong benefit for you. That $100,000 that otherwise would have been taxable was completely tax-free to you. Now here's where the planning point comes in. Let's assume that instead of doing it this way, what if you still had an HSA and still had expenses each year, and you still put $5,000 into your HSA, and you still had $5,000 in medical expenses? Well, what if in this case, we took funds from cash flow? So we took funds from cash flow each year and we used that to pay the $5,000, allowing our HSA balance to continue to grow, because remember, you can invest those dollars so those dollars can grow for you. Let's see what happens in this case. So you do this, and again, you do this for 20 years, like we did in the previous example, but now these funds are growing at 8% per year. Well, what that means is by the end of 20 years, so $5,000 per year, growing at 8% per year, you now have $289,000 in your HSA account. Think about how powerful that is going into retirement, where many people's biggest concern is, oh my goodness, what's it gonna cost for medical expenses? Whether it's Medicare premiums or health insurance premiums if you retire before 65, or just the cost of medical bills, think how powerful it would be to have a lump sum of money there that you could draw tax-free at any time to pay for all those bills. So yes, in this example, it did mean you had to come out of pocket $100,000 to pay for all these medical expenses, but in exchange for that, now what you have is you have $289,000, $189,000 of which is just growth on your dollars. So that's almost free money, not free because you grew it and you earned it, but that's $189,000 more dollars that you now have to pay for your medical expenses that you wouldn't have had you use your HSA balance on an annual basis to pay for medical bills. Now, this does require using cash flow. So this does require having the excess funds available to do this, but if you can, it can be a really powerful strategy because it's enhancing what you have available to you when the time comes to retire and you start paying some of those medical expenses. Now you might be asking, well, what can this HSA cover? Is this really restricted to just bills incurred by the hospital? No, there's a whole lot of things. Just a brief list here. This could be acupuncture, ambulance care, artificial limbs and teeth, chiropractor, crutches, dental treatment, doctor's office visits and copays, drug prescriptions, guide dogs, hearing aids and batteries, insulin, lab fees, orthodontics, orthotic inserts, over-the-counter medicines and drugs, PPE, physical therapy, surgery, excluding cosmetic surgery, vision exams, walkers, canes, wheelchairs. There's so much that this can go towards. It's not restrictive of, oh, this is only bills from your hospital. There's so much that this can be used for, many things that a lot of us have as part of our daily expense. Now, one quick side note, one of the least known things about HSAs, if you're listening to this and saying, oh my goodness, this is wonderful, I really want to fund an HSA, I just don't have the extra cash flow to do so this year. Well, the IRS allows for one trustee to trustee transfer from a traditional IRA to an HSA in any given year. So if you're 55 and older and you have a family plan, but you're not able to contribute to it and you really want to contribute to it, one time in your life, you're actually able to move funds from your traditional IRA into your HSA. Now, to make sure I'm clear on this isn't to say you can transfer an unlimited amount. It's not like you can take $100,000, fund the HSA and say, great, all my retirement expenses will be covered tax-free. You're still subject to the annual limits of $8,300. So if you do have a traditional IRA, say there's $100,000 in there, you could take $8,300 one time in your life, transfer that to your HSA, and now those funds are growing there. The benefit is, if you're paying for medical expenses in retirement, instead of that money being in your IRA, where you take it out, pay taxes, and then pay medical expenses, in this case, it's in the HSA. So you've made a tax-free transfer there, then you pull it out tax-free to cover medical expenses, and you avoid taxes on $8,300 in that example. Now, last couple details to make sure we're getting the full scope on how HSAs work and how you can put it to your benefit is beneficiaries. How does this work? Well, HSAs do have beneficiaries in the same way that an IRA or 401k does. If you pass, you want to make sure a beneficiary is named, but it works differently than it does with IRAs. If your spouse is your beneficiary of your HSA, well, if you pass away, they simply inherit it and they can continue to use it in the same way you could. Where it gets tricky is if maybe your children are your beneficiaries or your spouse has passed and then your children are the contingent beneficiaries. They can still inherit it, but unlike an IRA where you can spread out distributions from that over 10 years, with an HSA, they have to take it all out in that year that they inherit it. Now, the difference with your children inheriting it or anyone that's not your spouse is it's a taxable inheritance to them. So unlike you, if you have those funds, you can pull them out tax-free for medical expenses. Your spouse can pull them out tax-free for medical expenses. If your children inherit an HSA and say it's $50,000, they can't pull it out tax-free. That $50,000 that they receive, that would all be taxable income. So as part of the planning point, yes, it's good to have a large amount in your HSA balance, but it's not necessarily something you want growing forever. You don't want to just keep that rolling. It's not like a generational thing that can pass on to future generations. It can, but they lose the tax deferral, they lose the tax-free nature of it once anyone besides your spouse inherits it. So an HSA is a wonderful investment vehicle, and it should be used as part of a larger and more broad overall retirement strategy. If you're watching this and want to make sure that you get your HSA tied into your overall financial strategy, be sure to check out the video above, where I walk through the 5 steps you need to know to make sure you're on track to retire. Once again, I'm James Knoll, founder of Root Financial, and if you're interested in seeing how we help our clients at Root Financial get the most out of life with their money, be sure to visit us at www.rootfinancialpartners.com.